Hello everyone. Happy Sunday. If you are celebrating Easter, I hope you're having a glorious holiday and not watching this until after Easter so you spend that time with your family. But welcome to the 7th episode of Woke Roundup. This is a little show that I do exclusively on Rockfin every Sunday night to try to just cover some of the woke stories that I just haven't had a chance to throughout the rest of the week. And this week, as almost every single week, frankly, that I've been doing this show, we are going to start off with a story about Asian Americans. Now, those of you who have watched past episodes of this show know that this is actually a topic I have covered almost every single time since this show started, because I track on a daily basis what is going on in the news when it comes to different woke articles and how the media are covering things and things like that. And I was saying weeks before the shooting in Atlanta, I was like, what is going on with this sudden increase of articles trying to convince Asian Americans that they're oppressed? Because this was going on even before that shooting in Atlanta. And then, of course, the shooting happened. They took massive advantage of it. And now it's been like hammering ever since then with so many articles about how Asian Americans are oppressed and there's an increase in Asian American hate crime and all that stuff. But this started before that shooting. And I believe the reason it started is it happened to mysteriously coincide with when Chinese American groups started speaking against the woke incursion, if you will. Because remember, these are individuals many times who have grown up or have some understanding of the Cultural Revolution in China. Now, I've had on my channel, I've covered this a couple different times, people who've grown up during the Cultural Revolution in China. They understand the parallels that they're seeing between what happened then and what's going on now in the United States. And it's actually really scary when you hear their stories because the similarities are so eerie. It is absolutely crazy. So Chinese American groups understand what they're seeing with the woke gaining more and more power in the United States. And they're starting to speak out against it, say, no, we are not in favor of this. So, in response to that, the media comes back and says, but you are, because don't you know, you're really oppressed. You are oppressed because you are not white, and it is white supremacy. And then when the shootings happened in Atlanta, that's when they really started hammering that it was all about white supremacy all the time, even though we know statistically from the FBI that African Americans actually commit most of the hate crimes against Asian Americans, but never let the truth get in the way of a good story. No, it's got to be white supremacy. Well, I love what happens when they kind of like, when they lift the veil, they pull the mask down, if you will. They say the quiet part out loud. And on April 1st, I swear this is not an April Fool's joke, on April 1st, we got exactly that from FiveThirtyEight. Why recent violence against Asian Americans may solidify their support of Democrats. You mean that all this coverage, it isn't actually about fixing Asian hate crimes against Asian Americans? Not about that at all. It's only about solidifying power and convincing Asian Americans to vote like a block of mindless drones for the Democrats without thinking for themselves, because here's the problem with Asians. Here's the problem with Asians when it comes to the woke. Asians break every single pattern of oppression that the woke try to put on different minority groups. Asian Americans tend to outperform pasty white people like me. They tend to outperform us in school. They tend to do better professionally. Like they're doing just fine because meritocracy, hard work ethic is part of their culture, and parents instill that in their children. So when it comes to their oppression hierarchy, they kind of break the mold. They don't fit the narrative neatly that so many of the other groups do. So what do we do in response to that? Well, we have to convince them that they really are oppressed, even if they don't think that they are, because that's how you get them to vote for the Democrats. Let's read what FiveThirtyEight had to say about this. Even before the coronavirus became a worldwide pandemic, some astute observers of racial and ethnic politics feared that an emerging outbreak in China would lead to, and was already contributing to, a rise in anti-Asian sentiment in America. After all, the United States has a long and ugly history of scapegoating racial and ethnic groups for diseases in ways that are used to justify xenophobia. And of course, we all remember that they tried to convince us all that Donald Trump was being xenophobic when he shut down travel from China, which is actually one of the things that he did monumentally correctly in his handling of coronavirus. But, you know, we can't give him credit for anything, of course. Sadly, it didn't take long for these fears to be realized. Racist harassment, online verbal attacks, and public and physical assaults against Asian Americans all surged in the early days of the pandemic and have remained alarmingly high ever since. Now notice, anytime they're covering anti-Asian crimes, they do not say the race of the people perpetrating the crime unless that race is white. Every other time, when the person perpetrating the crime, every other time, go and look at all the articles about this if you don't believe me. Every other time, if the person is not white, they do not report their race. Because again, their goal here is to push a narrative. Their goal is not to tell the truth. The goal is to push a certain narrative. In fact, anti-Asian hate crimes in the US increased nearly 150% from 2019 to 2020, but it took the murder of 6 Atlanta women of Asian descent in March for many to finally realize the seriousness of the problem. According to Google Trends, Google searches like Asian Americans and violence against Asian Americans skyrocketed after the shooting. Well, again, this was going up before the shooting because the media was pushing this before the shooting. But yes, with the amount of coverage that increased after the shooting, I'm not at all surprised that it went through the roof. Google Trends, blah, blah, blah. Summarily, the shape of respondents in last week's YouGov Economist poll, who said there is a great deal of discrimination against Asian people, 33%, doubled since YouGov asked this question in March 2020. Of course, as targets of hatred, Asian Americans have been much more aware of the growing problem. In June 2020, Pew Research Center found 58% of Asian Americans said it is more common for people to express racist or racially insensitive views about people who are Asian than it was before the coronavirus outbreak, compared with just 39% of all adults, which is dumb. Let's just be clear. Asian Americans are not responsible for COVID. The Chinese Communist Party is responsible for COVID, but I also don't necessarily buy into this trend that they're illustrating because, again, the data does not, that I've seen about who is committing the anti-Asian hate crimes, it doesn't back up what's being reported. So why wouldn't I question it? And frankly, all of you should question it as well. What they're doing is they're trying to conform to a story. This is why they don't report the races of the people that are committing the hate crimes. And listen, I don't care what someone's race is. I don't care if they are black or brown or white or any other race. If they're committing a hate crime against any other group, that is an indefensible act. But if we actually are committed to solving violence against Asian Americans, then we have to be honest about what is going on. And I have never bought into this narrative, and I know many of you probably haven't either, that this was all about COVID, because it just doesn't make any functional sense. The effect of this hatred has partisan ramifications too. Asian Americans' escalating fears of discrimination and harassment during the pandemic will likely solidify their already strong support of the Democrats. And there it really is. That's what this is really about. That's why there was increased coverage even before the attacks in Atlanta. That is why they never report the race of the perpetrators, because it is not about bringing awareness to the increase in anti-Asian attacks. It is solely about using these incidents in order to solidify support around the Democrats. And what does it mean? What does it mean if African Americans are actually committing most of these crimes? Well, you can't say Black Lives Matter and Asian Lives Matter in the same sentence if those things are true. Then you have to have a hard discussion about why African Americans are committing most of these hate crimes and why, I'm sorry, how can those two things be true at once if African Americans are the ones that are perpetrating hate crimes against Asian Americans It just makes absolutely no sense. But of course, we can't have an honest conversation about this. The Democrats are incapable of having an honest conversation about what is going on and why to stop it, because all they know how to do is blame white supremacy, white supremacy, white supremacy, white supremacy. They advance narratives like only white people can be racist, or racism is prejudice plus power, and only the white population has the power, so they are the only population that can be racist. Really, it is only about solidifying support behind one political party, because they know that if they were having an honest conversation about this, if they were actually reporting accurately what was going on instead of lying by omission in their reporting, that would not create a golden bridge to deliver to the Asian American community. Say, come over here to the Democrats. The Democrats are the party of love. They're the party of kindness. And we would never perpetrate these crimes, except that we won't tell you that African Americans are disproportionately the ones committing the crimes, because we want you to feel welcome. And we want you to feel as though the only party that you have to vote for is the Democrats, because those evil Republicans, those evil righties, they don't care about hate crimes against Asian Americans, but we are the kind, empathetic ones who care. That's exactly the game that they're playing. Over 3/4 of Asian Americans and Pacific Islander voters who thought there was a great deal or a lot of anti-Asian discrimination in the U.S. supported Joe Biden over Donald Trump in a weekly Democracy Fund plus UCLA Nationscape surveys conducted from April to September 2020, but only 37% of Asian Americans who didn't think there was any anti-Asian discrimination preferred Biden to Trump in the presidential election. And there you have it, folks. The Asian Americans who believe the narrative are much more likely to support the Democrats than the ones who question the narrative. That is what is going on. And they just told you right out in the open. Right out in the open.